everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Montessori community conversation. As I was starting to this meeting, I was trying to remember how many we had, and I must honestly say that I don't remember how many we have done already, so I can't give you the count. But here we are. Oh, Radka says, so this is a sixth one or a seventh one or something like that. Okay, thank you, Radka. It's a pleasure to see you again. And our guest today is Marc Frankel. And I am going to ask Peter to please kindly introduce Marc to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirka. So I've known Marc for probably 20 some years. He's a founder and partner of Triangle Associates, which is a consulting firm especially for international private schools that's located in St. Louis. And I think by reputation, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that I think Marc is by reputation the leading consultant for international private schools. And I have worked with him on a number of occasions, as has Kathy, as has Sue. He has been a speaker at Montessori Administrators Association retreats, at the AMI USA refresher course. Importantly for me, Marc and I traveled around the Middle East together a number of times, presenting leadership workshops to private school administrators. And he's a psychologist by training and background, which is interesting. But I think he keeps pace with what's going on in the world of private education probably better and more than anybody else I know. So I think he's going to have some valuable insights to offer us this morning or this afternoon for some of you, or this evening. And so with no further ado, Marc Frankel.
Thank you, Peter. The structure of the session is going to be as usual. Marc will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll go into the question and answer session. And Marc, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you to Lead Montessori for the invitation to be here, and to Peter, Kathy, and Sue for putting my name forward. This is a real privilege to get to speak with you all about a scary topic this morning, schools on the brink. So we'll try to keep it practical for everyone, because as I look through the names that I see signing up, and I know many of you are in schools that aren't on the brink. And think about today as being less about, for you, how to know when, than how to see the warning signs early when they're starting to appear, so that you can take action to avoid reaching a point where your school is on the brink. For those who English is not your first language, at least badly accented American English, I apologize for not being able to do this in your language. I'm glad we have the Russian translation going on with Barbara, and I apologize to Barbara in advance for anything I say that might be hard for her to follow or translate. And please, if you have questions, send them through the chat window. I won't be watching it as we go along, but Mirka and Solana will, and they'll feed questions to me afterward when we take a break, all right? And you're also welcome to my slides. I will make a new PDF of them afterward. There are a couple of things added from what I sent over to Barbara and Mirka last night. So I'll send a new PDF, and they can share it with you via whatever portal you use at Lead Montessori for doing that. As Peter said, I'm not a Montessorian, I'm a psychologist by training, but I have a special fondness for Montessori schools, because I think they're fascinating places, and they're such interesting psychological environments in a lot of ways. And today we're going to talk about a psychological topic, and that's knowing when things are critical at your school, being able to form an accurate and rational diagnosis. So we're going to walk through the barriers to that. We're going to talk about the indicators to look at, and then you're going to get the opportunity to apply that to your school. So when you hear me talking, what I want you to be thinking about is, what am I seeing at my school? What do I look at when I see the profit and loss statement? What do I see when I look at my balance sheet? When I walk out in the hallway, what do I notice changing and shifting in the audience? So we'll unpack all of this as we go along. I'll start sharing my slides, and we'll go through them. So when I get to the end, I'll unshare and then be able to come back and see you all. So let's find the right window here to share. If I've done this correctly, you should be seeing just one slide screen that says Schools on the Brink. And yes, when you get the slides from me, you'll have my contact info. So if you want to ask questions afterward, or want me to amplify on something or follow up in any way, I'm happy to do that with you. Just drop me a note through email. It's probably the best way to reach me. So let's really begin with where we are with this. There's a sort of baseline state that we're in the industry right now. It's a baseline state that existed back in the ancient times in January and in December, before the whole world was taken over by the COVID pandemic. So if you can remember way back to the beginning of the year, which really does seem like a long time ago right now, schools were in this condition, a sort of perpetually undercapitalized small business state. And that's true of the vast majority of Montessori schools. For me, one of the great joys of Montessori schools as clients is that they are, for the most part, small schools, and they're very intimate learning environments. They're usually, compared to, say, larger private independent schools with which I also work, they're relatively shorn of all the frills that go along with school, and they're really focused on the very essence of learning and the social emotional development of children. But they're undercapitalized small businesses, and that fact is a baseline state that's true really in all small private schools in the world, no matter where they are and what their pedagogical focus. So if that's our baseline state, it's not going to take too much of a boulder thrown into the pond to splash a lot of water out and create a disturbance in the ecosystem. And we got just such a boulder in the hinge event of COVID. And that term hinge event is a really important one, because a lot of what I'm going to say from here on out is based upon the notion that this one is truly a hinge event. In many ways, we can look back at other events and say they were hinge events too. This one is the first that arguably will affect each and every place on the planet. There's nowhere that's immune to the virus. It's made it every place now. It's on every continent, it's in every country, and case numbers may vary, but the reality is that within a couple of months, this swept the entire world. And at least in my grasp of history, there's very little that's had that same impact since the Great Plague. So this one is a hinge event, and I'm sure that we'll be demarking time henceforth between our before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID sorts of classifications. And the McKinsey Consulting Group, if you're familiar with them, they're a global management consultancy focusing on really very large business and governments, published an article a couple of weeks ago, the title of which I think captures perfectly the moment of this hinge event. And the title was, "The Future is Not What It Used to Be." So whatever we thought 2020 was going to look like back on midnight on January 1st, it hasn't looked like that, and it won't look like that. And the likelihood is that 2021 won't look like we thought it was going to either, or 2022 or 2023. So into that landscape comes the question of, how do we gauge the health, the financial, the business health of our school, and know what's the best course of action to take? And I want to bring up a quote from a friend of mine, a longtime colleague, Josie Holford, who was also a longtime head of school. And Josie says that Schools come and schools go. They grow, shrink, change shape, expand, splinter, merge, morph, move, and they die. And that's always a sad event when they die. But we need to face realistically the fact that no organization endures forever. Organizations change, and most businesses in the world have a lifespan less than a single human being. They have a birth, a life course, and a death that's less than 70 or 80 years. For small businesses, it's even shorter than that. So the fact that we do have private schools in the world that have endured for hundreds of years is a remarkable testament to the value that those schools provide and the emotional investment that people place in them. But that those are just a fraction of all the private schools that have ever existed is also a testament to the fact that not every school will be 350 years old. Not every school will be 600 years old. Schools will come and go, grow, shrink, change shape, expand, splinter, merge, morph, move, and some will die. So let's unpack a few basic premises that we're coming from today. The first is that every organization in the world is going to be transformed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Doesn't matter whether you're big business, small business, government, private, public, partnership, you're going to be changed by this in some way. Every organization will emerge either stronger or weaker as a result, but none will be exactly the same when we get to whatever the term next normal means in the context of COVID. So for us today, the question we take up is, how do we decide the path that makes sense for our school? And how do we know how to read the signs that tell us that a more radical path is going to be essential? So as we get through this, I want to talk today about three things. Where we are now, briefly, and that's the DC phase, the during COVID phase. How to analyze your situation, and the options of continuing the mission, merging, or humanely closing the school. Now, you can notice the asterisk and the text at the bottom of the slide says that there isn't going to be an AC, an after COVID, until we have either a reliable, safe, effective vaccine, or the virus mutates into something less lethal, as did the 1918 flu, or we found an effective treatment that can be easily administered. Absent those things, none of which are likely in the next 12 to 18 months, we're probably looking at a global game of whack-a-mole with outbreaks here and outbreaks there and continuing disturbance from this. So the net result is that our schools are facing unprecedented headwinds. And that's our theme, is going to be endless headwinds, and how do we know when those headwinds are getting the best of us? If you're an airplane flying over an ocean and you're going into brutal oncoming winds, you have instruments to look at to tell you how well your plane is keeping up with those headwinds and how capable it is of staying in the air. We're going to look at what some of those instrument gauges are for your school and how to read them. Globally, the size of the headwinds can be summed up in this slide, which comes to us from UNESCO. And it says that in the world, 191 countries have closed some or all of their schools in response to COVID-19. That's an amazing number. 191 countries in the world don't agree on anything, and yet somehow they've agreed to close all their schools. So that's what I mean by the pervasive impact of this hinge event. But that number of 1.6 billion kids that are out of school as a result is a truly remarkable number. That's both amazing and tragic at the same time. And it also tells you, wherever you are in the world and whatever challenges COVID has produced for you, that you've got a lot of company out there in the world. Company that's indicated by that 1.6 billion kids whose schools are in some state today of compromise. But The last thing about the current context I want to say is that there really is no economic recovery until there's an epidemiological recovery. So until we have found a way to handle this virus, or the virus has handled itself, we're really going to be dealing with this and the fallout. So you're in a marathon, you're not in a sprint. This is going to go on, and we're really only probably about the first leg of the race. There's a lot more ahead. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the topic of being on the brink. And I'm going to use a metaphor for this that I apologize for in advance if it sounds a bit too morbid. But I want us to think about an idea of hospice for schools. The notion that at some point, and all around the world, there are hospice programs for people that are near the end of life. But at some point, for schools, we need to read the signs and know when it's time to begin unwinding the school and to let it go. So we're going to talk about the requirements for being able to make that decision about how close to hospice is a school, and how can we walk it through a humane unwinding rather than let it come to a catastrophic end. And the catastrophic end is best emblemized by a public charter school here in St. Louis, where I live, last year, that closed 6 weeks into the school year in October and simply told students on Friday night that they would not have a school to go to on Monday morning. That's a tragic situation for the students, for the teachers, for parents, for everyone in the community. And the usual ending of a school tends to be more disruptive and abrupt than it has to be. So we're going to focus on what a humane end would look like, and a humane transition if you want to take another path and continue the mission. So to begin with the requirements, I think the first is an intensely psychological one in heads of school, owners of schools, if it's a proprietary school or a family business, for board members who are charged with trusteeship of the school, for faculty who are trying to deliver the highest quality Montessori education. And the first thing to get around psychologically is the acceptance that closure does not equal failure. The pedagogy worked. Your school was successful with kids. What didn't work was the economic model, the business model, the demand characteristics of your environment. It wasn't your idea that didn't work. It wasn't the concept of a school. The school worked, the business didn't. Acceptance doesn't equal failure of the things that matter most here, which is your perpetuation of the Montessori pedagogy for children. It helps to take an outsider's viewpoint, to be able to look at your school situation as if you were someone not connected to the school. What would an outsider say if your sister came to visit and you told her the circumstances of your school? What would she say? Would she look at the numbers and be horrified? Or would she say, you should keep going? The outsider's view prevents you from letting the proverbial rose-colored glasses get in the way of seeing the school as it really is and seeing the environment that the school sits in as it really is. The American writer Jim Collins, one of the business guru writers of the past 20 or 30 years, penned a book some years ago called Good to Great. He also wrote a version of it for not-for-profit organizations. But one of the things that he made clear in Good to Great was that great leaders are able to see the brutal facts, that was his term, the brutal facts of their situation, the good, the bad, the really ugly, and analyze them in a coldly rational way. They were also able to do that analysis anchored in unshakable beliefs, another term from Collins, unshakable beliefs about what mattered most and what would endure. So the outsider's viewpoint is essential to being able to do that level of analysis. A rational analysis follows, and then one can choose a way forward. And the way forward could be to continue the mission, and we'll talk a little bit about what that could look like in a different way. School goes on, perhaps with some changes. A merger with a like-minded school, which happens shockingly infrequently in the schools world. It happens all the time in the business world, and it happens relatively rarely in the schools world. We think it probably needs to happen more frequently, because at some point scale helps you, and by buddying up with another nearby similarly missioned school with a similar pedagogy, you may be able to find a way forward, or absent any of those, bringing about a humane end. So let's talk about doing the analysis. Element of doing analysis is to look for the cash flow signals. Look at what it's telling you. What are you reading in your P&L and balance sheet over time? Are you using next year's tuition to pay this year's bills? It's expedient. It may seem like a way to patch through, but once you start doing that, very few schools come back. We're seeing statistics about ventilator use and COVID-19 that show that patients that end up on ventilators are 75 or 80% likely not to come off. Very small number of patients survive. Same is true for schools that begin using next year's tuition to pay this year's bills. Very few are able to turn that around in any sort of meaningful way. And it's usually the beginning of the road to further problems in the future. We're currently being rescued by an angel donor. This is particularly true if you're a nonprofit and there's a family or two that have been instrumental in funding the start of the school, and now you're leaning on them to periodically underwrite deficits, or if you're a family investment and you're continually finding yourself needing to put more capital into the business in order to keep it going. Opting to pay penalties rather than satisfy debts, so letting your arrears charges accumulate, paying credit card penalties, paying tax penalties, not making your taxation filings on time. These are all signals that something's amiss in the capacity of your school to continue as an ongoing business. Whoops, something went backward on me there. Credit limit is maxed out. Your borrowing capacity is gone. Your credit cards are at the ceiling, and you're no longer able to get your bank to talk with you about money. There's a repeat of board conversations for those of you who have boards about shuffling money from one place to another, reducing staff, finding ways to patch through. Oops, somehow it's starting to take us back. I'll go forward again, sorry. I'm not doing well driving my PowerPoint today. You're delaying needed maintenance on the school, and that only accumulates over time. It may not come back to bite you next year, but the year after that, it almost certainly will. There are conditional audits for those of you who engage an external auditor to look at your books every year. And if you're a nonprofit entity in the United States, that's going to be most of you. Conditional audits are when the auditors flag something as a non-standard practice or raise concerns about viability based on something they're seeing in the audit. And when that's happening year after year, meaning you're not able to fix it to satisfy them the next year, it becomes a real signal that something chronically is amiss in the business. Ongoing enrollment and attrition issues. So too many kids leaving, they complete Children's House and they leave, they don't make it on to lower L, they don't transition from the toddler program to Children's House, or they bail out after lower L and don't continue into upper L. Those sorts of attrition issues are present, or just demand at the front end. The families aren't showing up at your door, or the families showing up at your door are interested in your school, but they lack the capacity to be able to afford the minimum tuition you need in order to be able to stay open. So the enrollment issues and attrition issues can come from a lot of places, but when they're ongoing and chronic, perpetually under-enrolled school, perpetual attrition problems, then that also signals to us that something's amiss. And finally, and this is especially true, any or all of the above when you have positive local demography, when there are enough kids nearby. Many of us in the West, and some people in the East, but mostly in the West, are dealing with adverse demography right now. There are ever fewer kids in the areas we live in, and an ever older adult population. In that kind of environment, it's not unusual to see schools having chronic enrollment issues. But if you're having chronic enrollment issues and there are plenty of kids around, or if you're not able to find enough people to pay the tuition that you need to charge, and there are plenty of kids around, then you've got a different situation. So the above are warning signals, and they're especially concerning to me when you have positive local demography, if you're in one of the places in the world where that's still true. So coming out of that, you may decide that things are nasty, but not bad enough to think about either merging or closing the school. So how could you continue the mission, perhaps with some changes in place? So it's time to go back to basics. If you want to continue the mission and try to stay in business, and you have a little bit of runway in order to do that, we like to say there's from the proverbial children's fairy tale of the wolf being at the door. There's the wolf scale. Where is the wolf? Is the wolf at the door? Is the wolf down the street? Is the wolf in the living room, or is he in the kitchen eating out of the refrigerator already? And if we go back to basics and we say, okay, the wolf's maybe on the block or getting close, but he's not in the house yet. We're not on the ropes. Then we'll maybe try some of these. You review your mission for currency and resonance. How compelling is your mission to your market? Do parents identify with it? When they see a mission, are they able to say, yeah, I want that for my kid? And remember that simply, and I'll say something a little bit provocatively here, so forgive me, simply being a Montessori school is not a very compelling mission for a family. The family wants the outcomes that the Montessori school provides. So are you able to articulate the outcomes your school achieves with kids in ways that families say, yeah, I want that? You could use the current jobs to be done analysis. And if you're not familiar with jobs to be done, JTBD theory, I'd point you to some work by Clayton Christensen, the disruptive innovation guy at Harvard, who talks about the concept of parents hiring a school. Forgive me for putting it in this language. This is his language, not mine. Parents hiring a school to do a job. How well does your school do those jobs? And are you doing the jobs parents want to hire somebody to do with their kid? So mission, jobs to be done is a congruence. And if you want to know more about jobs to be done and how it might apply to a school, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to send you some papers that others have written on the subject. Have hard conversations with your staff, with other administrators, with other owners, and make really distinct decisions about things. What continues and what stops? What do we no longer need to do? What could be trimmed if we need to trim? But what are people really wanting to pay for so that we can have enough kids to try to get our school back in the air again? So having those tough conversations without preserving something simply because it's a nice to have is a critical component of doing any level of continue the mission analysis. And then finally, develop a mathematical plan to viability. I'm really emphasizing the math here. It needs to work out on paper. It's often a radical step. You may need to revise your mission to something the market is more willing to purchase. You may need to reset your tuition scale using any of a number of strategies for scalable, flexible tuition models. You may need to merge with another school nearby to find some expense reductions and scale advantages, or you may even need to close for a year or two and try to reorganize the business and perhaps reopen in a different area of town closer to where families are and where kids are. We've seen schools do all of these things successfully, but it requires being able to find a mathematical model that you can spreadsheet the economics of and see a pathway at the end to getting clear. Now, we said a little bit about merger. So let's say you've decided that your school can't continue, but you'd like to pursue a merger with a school nearby. As I said, these don't happen very much. They don't happen in the real world very much. And more schools start having conversations about merger and back off than actually finish them. But it really requires finding a like-minded school, a school that approaches education in the same way, values the same things, works in the same manner, and essentially serves families that would complement the families that your school serves. And workable mergers take a tremendous amount of time. They're rarely done successfully when they're done in desperation. And when two schools are on the ropes, it rarely ends up being more than deciding to go broke together rather than separately. What the key notion to make a successful merger is to find an animating idea that the schools can be together, that they could not be separately. And that animating idea is what people then rally behind. And when you do that, it usually yields a greater scale of school. And by greater scale, we frankly mean a larger school, which gives you more degrees of freedom when it comes to future options. As lovely as small schools were, and my son Alex went to a very small school. He attended a 190 student pre-K through 6 school here in St. Louis, and I was on its board for 6 years. And even though we were very well enrolled across that time, we were always just 3 or 4 kids away from disaster at any given moment when it came to the budget. And scale helps a bit with that. You can obviously have schools that are too big, but you can also have schools that are so small that their mere smallness makes them vulnerable to any wind blowing in the environment. Leverage the value of staff, facilities, and administrators. Find ways to economize. You won't, and it's a nasty thing to say here, but you probably won't need everybody in the support staff world when you bring the school together, and there may be some expense savings that occur. Don't go into the merger believing that you can preserve every job in your school post-merger. Trim shared expenses, business office, maintenance, any place where you can economize by dropping to 1 rather than 2 functions is going to be a plus in a merger, and it's going to give you an added boost coming out of the merger on the numbers side. Now let's turn our attention in our last few minutes here to affecting a humane closure. So you're deciding to put your school in hospice, give it morphine and Ativan, and let it go. What does that look like in a school world and in a business? And there's several components to this. And this first one, I can't say strongly enough. You need to give notice to staff and families well in advance. They need to be able to plan what's next for them. And this may hurt to give them that notice. It may scare you that they will leave even sooner, but to not give them that notice is both inhumane and wrong. They need to be able to make plans, and part of your job as a proprietor, as a school head, as a board member, is to help them find an alternative for their kid, and help teachers find alternatives for their work. The working team shifts to a closing team, and this is really hard. It's smaller and more focused. It's really hard to close a business that you're emotionally invested in. Some years ago, when Judy Schechtman, my business partner, and I were doing a leadership institute for the National Association of Independent Schools here in the United States, we did it outside Denver, Colorado, in a hotel that it turned out that we were the last meeting to be held in the hotel. When our meeting left, the hotel was being torn down and a new development going up. So it was a little bit creepy. We were, pretty big hotel, not very many people in it. But what we discovered was that Sheraton hotels, when that's happening, Sheraton sends in a closing team because the team that ran the hotel is rarely effective at closing it. So they have a roving closing team whose job it is to unwind the business. That's not possible in the schools world, but the working team whose job it was yesterday to keep the school going now becomes the closing team whose job it is to wrap up the business. And that's usually a smaller and more focused set of activities. You need to wind down the remaining assets and records of the school. So it's time to break out your articles of association, bylaws, school constitution, incorporation charter, whatever it's called, wherever you are in the world. Give it a really close read to find the dissolution clause that speaks to what happens when it's time to wind down the business. And it will say something about how remaining assets are handled and how records are retained. School records probably have legal status in most areas and need to be retained for a particular period of time. And the assets will have a particular way of being wound down. If you're a nonprofit, the assets cannot be distributed to the board or to management. The assets must go to a like-missioned institution. If you're a for-profit business, then the owners or family would receive the remaining assets of the school. And if it's closing time, then you're going to need legal and accounting advice. So hear this very clearly: closing costs money. Don't do it without counsel, because there are too many pitfalls you can make along the way that will end up costing you even more money. So when you have your idea together about closing and how you want to do it, be sure and speak with the qualified attorney in your jurisdiction to make sure that you're doing it in a way that complies with local law about your particular type of business and about the kinds of employees you have and employment requirements that go around that. The timeline is, as I said, crucial for families, students, staff. They need warning. You build a process to support the community through the transition, and you communicate that endlessly to your community, that you're there to support them and you're there to help them find a transition school. Remember, your fidelity is to your school and to Montessori. So you want families to find another great Montessori school if yours is going to be closing. And if that's the case, if you can really internalize that, then your mission shifts from being, I'll educate this child, to being, I'll help this child find a Montessori school in which to be educated. And then celebrate the school's history. Even if it's been open just a few years, it has a history. It has kids that loved it and flourished there. Celebrate that, acknowledge it, have the end of school year party to say goodbye to the school. Students need that. And then make sure that you attend to all the governmental filings and final distribution of assets, because as emotionally traumatic as it is to wind down a school, you really don't want the government coming back to you 2 years later and saying, why haven't you been filing various forms or making tax payments that they were expecting? So be sure you've attended to all of that, and the best way to do that is to get really good legal and accounting advice in your area. That's a lot. Now, as I said, the wind down of any business of any form is a very psychologically meaningful moment. And it's important to know what ends and what doesn't end. And for you, if it's your business, whether it's the nonprofit you started or the business you own, grieve, it's ending. It's a death, it's a loss of something, and it's as emotionally meaning for you as the death of a family member or pet. It's a loss. Feel the loss. Your community will feel the loss, and your job is to feel it with them. But know too that the Montessori approach to education continues. You're part of this worldwide communion of Montessorians that's represented by all of the faces on the screen and the people hearing the Facebook stream. So you win, maybe not by continuing your school, but you win by making sure your families continue in Montessori, and maybe you can come back to play another day in a different form, either with a different school, in a different part of town, or in a different moment in time, once whatever AC after COVID starts to take clearer shape, whenever that happens. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have spent some time sharing thoughts with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can see faces again, and then I'm going to see what kind of questions Mirka and Svetlana are seeing on the chat screen.